The day my father looked at me and said, "You don't belong here." I was standing in the middle of a boardroom in downtown Ottawa with 30 people watching. Not a stranger's boardroom. His. The company my grandfather built. The name above the door that matched the name on my birth certificate. And he looked right through me like I was someone who had wandered in off the street. I was 26 years old. I had just driven 4 hours from Toronto in a snowstorm because he called me. He actually called me. First time in 2 years. I should have known better. My father was not a cruel man in the way you picture cruel men. He didn't yell. He didn't break things. He was the kind of man who made you feel invisible so slowly, so carefully, that by the time you realized what had happened, you'd already started to disappear. He had a son from his first marriage, my half-brother Everett, 8 years older than me, built like my father, laughed like my father, even gestured with his hands the same way. When they stood together at family dinners, they looked like a before and after photo. My father the original, Everett the improved version. I was from the second marriage. My mother was a structural engineer from Montreal. Quiet woman, precise. She had a way of pausing before she spoke that some people read as hesitation and others read as intelligence. My father, I think, read it as both, and resented her for it after they divorced. I grew up in Hull, right across the river from Ottawa. In the house my mother bought with her settlement. Not a small house, not a bitter house, just hers. She lined the walls with technical drawings and made me do math problems at the kitchen table on Saturday mornings, while the CBC played in the background. She was the one who taught me what a load-bearing wall was. She was the one who took me to job sites when I was 10, handed me a hard hat 2 sizes too big for my head, and said, "Look at how that beam is distributing the weight. Do you see it?" I saw it. I always saw it. My father, when I visited on alternating holidays, had a different kind of education in mind. He wanted me to smile at clients. Pour coffee. Learn which wine to open at dinner. I was his daughter, which in his mind meant I was eventually going to marry someone useful. And that was contribution enough. He never said it that plainly. He didn't have to. What he said was things like, "Everett has a real head for this business," while I was sitting right there with a 94 average in physics. What he said was, "You're so pretty, you could do anything," which sounds like a compliment until you understand that what he meant was that being pretty was the most useful thing I had going for me. I stopped visiting when I was 19. It wasn't dramatic. I just stopped going. My mother didn't ask me to explain it. She made tea and put her hand on my shoulder, and that was the end of that conversation. I went to the University of Waterloo, civil engineering. Graduated 3rd in my class. Got a job at a mid-sized firm in Toronto, doing structural assessments on commercial builds. It wasn't glamorous. It involved a lot of early mornings and cold sites and conversations with contractors who initially talked past me until I opened my mouth, and they realized I actually knew what I was talking about. I liked my life. It was mine. It had no shadow of my father's name in it. And then my father called. It was a Thursday evening in late January. I was eating leftover pasta and watching the news. His name came up on my phone and I stared at it for 3 full rings before I answered. He told me Everett had made a mistake. A significant one. A commercial property development in Gatineau. 12-story mixed-use building. Condos on top, retail below, had failed its structural review. The city had flagged concerns on the foundation design. The project was frozen. Investors were pulling out. The general contractor was threatening to walk. My father's firm had staked a lot on this project. He said the word reputation twice in 2 minutes, which told me everything I needed to know about what actually worried him. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't mention the 2 years of silence. He said, "I've heard you've been doing good work," as if that was an apology. And then he said, "I need someone who understands what went wrong with this foundation." I asked him why he wasn't calling Everett. There was a pause. Everett is handling the client relationships, he said, which meant Everett had made the mistake and couldn't be seen to be fixing it. Which meant my father needed someone competent enough to solve the problem, but expendable enough that if it went badly, it wouldn't cost him anything important. Which meant me. I should have said no. I know that. I've replayed that phone call more times than I can count, and every time I get to that moment, I know exactly what I should have said. But there was something in his voice. Not warmth, exactly. More like necessity. And I had spent enough of my life wanting something from this man that I recognized my own hunger and walked straight into it anyway. I said I'd come look at the drawings. I drove up on a Tuesday. The site was in Gatineau, a 20-minute drive from downtown Ottawa, on a street that was half-finished development and half-empty lots waiting to become something. The building was mid-construction, covered in scaffolding. Quiet in the way construction sites go quiet when a problem has stopped everything. My father met me in the site trailer. He did not hug me. He shook my hand, which felt strange in a way I couldn't quite name. He introduced me to the project manager, a man named Whitmore who had the look of someone who hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks. He introduced me to the lead contractor, a woman named Souza, who sized me up in about 4 seconds with the kind of efficiency I respected. He introduced me to 2 other engineers from his firm whose names I have since forgotten. He did not introduce me as his daughter. He said, "This is a consultant I've brought in to take a look at the foundation issue." Whitmore nodded. Souza nodded. The 2 engineers looked at each other, and then from the back of the trailer, someone I hadn't noticed said, "What's she supposed to be looking at exactly?" I turned around. It was Everett, leaning against the back wall with his arms crossed, wearing a jacket with the company logo on it. He was looking at me the way you look at something that has shown up where it isn't supposed to be. My father said, "She's here to help." Everett looked at my father. Then he looked at me. Then he said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "I didn't realize we were that desperate." The trailer went still. Whitmore looked at his clipboard. Souza looked at the wall. The 2 engineers found something fascinating to study on the floor. My father said nothing. I have thought a lot about that silence. The way he just let it sit there. Didn't correct Everett. Didn't defend me. Didn't even clear his throat. He stood there and let his son speak to his daughter that way, in a room full of people, and the only thing he did was shuffle some papers on the table like the sound of them would cover what had just happened. I didn't walk out. I wish I could say I made some dignified exit, but I didn't. I stood there and I felt 17 years old again, sitting at his dinner table, trying to talk about my physics mark, while he and Everett discussed hockey. Then I picked up the foundation drawings and I said, "Can someone show me the bore logs from the site assessment?" Because the building wasn't going to fix itself, and neither, it turned out, was I. I spent 3 days going through everything, the bore logs, the soil reports, the original geotechnical assessment, the foundation design, the load calculations. I went back to the site twice, with a flashlight and my own measuring tape, and crouched in spaces that smelled like cold concrete and groundwater. The problem, when I found it, was almost elegant in how it had hidden itself. The original geotechnical report had underestimated the depth of a soft clay layer beneath the east corner of the site. Not by much, maybe 1.5 meters, but enough. The foundation design had been calculated against soil that wasn't actually there. Under load, the east corner would settle unevenly. In a 12-story building, that was not a cosmetic problem. Everett had signed off on the foundation design. I wrote up my findings in a report. 12 pages, clear language, no jargon where it wasn't necessary, 3 remediation options with cost estimates and timelines, ranked by effectiveness. I emailed it to my father that Thursday evening. He called me 20 minutes later. "This is going to be expensive," he said. "Yes," I said. "The investors are already nervous." I understand that. But option 2 is achievable in about 6 weeks. And the cost is manageable relative to what a partial collapse would mean. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're sure about the clay layer?" "I brought in a second geotechnical assessment," I said. "The firm is Renaud and Associates out of Gatineau. Their findings match mine." Another silence, and then, after a pause, "Good work." 2 words. Good work. Delivered like a receipt handed over a counter. I wrote them down in my notebook afterward, because I wanted to remember exactly how they felt. Not warm, not meaningful. Just transactional, so that I would stop waiting for something different. The project review meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. It was supposed to be my father, Everett Whitmore Souza, the lead investor. A man named Fortin, who had put in somewhere north of $4 million, and a representative from the City of Gatineau Planning and Permits Office. I was not on the original attendee list. My father added me 48 hours before the meeting. He sent me the calendar invite without any message attached. I spent the weekend preparing. When I arrived at the boardroom, his firm's boardroom, on the 14th floor of a glass tower on Spark Street, I was 15 minutes early. I set up my laptop. I organized my printed copies. I checked the projector. Everett arrived 8 minutes before the start time. He walked in, saw me, and stopped. "Why is she presenting?" he said. "To the room." "Not to me, to the room." My father walked in behind him. He looked at Everett. He looked at me. He said, "She found the issue. She's presenting the fix." "I could have found the issue," Everett said. "If I'd had more time." "You had 6 months," my father said, and then he sat down and opened his notebook, and that was the end of that. It was the first time, in my entire life, that I had heard my father correct his son on my behalf. It was not an apology. It was not acknowledgement of anything. It was a man running out of time and choosing the practical option. But I looked down at my papers and took one slow breath, because even that small, accidental moment landed somewhere I hadn't expected. The meeting started. Fortin came in with a woman from his office and a look on his face that said he had considered walking away from this project 3 times already and was still deciding. The city rep, a man named Beaumont, came in with a folder and a very controlled expression. I presented for 40 minutes. I walked them through the soil issue, the original error, the 2 geotechnical reports, and the remediation plan. I answered Beaumont's questions directly. I answered Fortin's questions directly. When Fortin pushed back on the timeline for option 2, I showed him the math, walked him through the load-bearing sequence for the remediation piers, and told him that the 6-week timeline was conservative and we might come in under it. Beaumont asked if the second geotechnical firm had done this kind of remediation before. I said yes, and I had the project references on the next slide. Fortin looked at my father. He said, "Who is she?" My father opened his mouth, and that was the moment the door opened. I didn't know who she was when she walked in. Late 50s, gray blazer, a posture that suggested she had never once in her professional life been uncertain about whether she belonged somewhere. She introduced herself as Marguerite Tessier. She was the Federal Infrastructure Advisor for the National Capital Region, there to observe as part of a routine compliance check on projects near the interprovincial boundary. She was also, as it turned out, on the advisory board of the Waterloo Engineering Department. She had read my thesis. She recognized my name on the sign-in sheet. She sat down. She looked at the slides I had on the projection screen. She looked at me. She said, "You graduated in the Waterloo cohort that did the Brampton Overpass project?" I said yes. She said, "That remediation approach was yours?" I said yes. She looked at Fortin. She said, "You should listen to what she's telling you. She's one of the sharper structural analysts I've seen come through that program in the last decade. If she says option 2 works, it works." The room was quiet. I looked at my father. He was looking at Marguerite Tessier. Then he looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something on his face that I had never seen directed at me before. Not pride. I want to be clear about that. I am not interested in rewriting this into something it wasn't. It was closer to the expression people get when they realize they have been holding something carelessly and almost dropped it. Everett was looking at the table. Fortin said, "All right, let's talk about the remediation timeline." And we did. The meeting ran another hour and a half. By the end of it, Fortin had agreed to proceed with option 2. Beaumont said the city would expedite the permit review, given the documented findings. Souza said her crew could mobilize within 2 weeks once the materials were sourced. After it was over, people filtered out. Whitmore shook my hand. Souza nodded at me, in the way that meant something. Beaumont paused on his way out and said, "Well done," quietly, and kept walking. "Marguerite," Tessier stopped at my elbow. She said, "If you're ever thinking about moving back to the NCR, there are some good projects coming through the Federal Infrastructure Program. Send me your CV." She handed me her card and left. I stood there holding the card. Behind me, my father said my name. I turned around. It was just the two of us in the boardroom. Everett had already gone. The catering staff were clearing the water glasses. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Ottawa looked flat and white and frozen. He said, "You did good work." Same words as before. But he was looking at me differently. I put Marguerite's card in my jacket pocket. I started packing up my laptop. He said, "I didn't know. About Waterloo. The thesis." I stopped. I thought about the parent-teacher night in grade 11, where I told him I wanted to go into engineering, and he said, "You'd be better suited to something where you can work with people." I thought about the Christmas I was 20 where I tried to show him a project I'd worked on, and he spent the whole dinner talking to Everett about a renovation job in Canada. I thought about all the times I had wanted him to ask. I said, "You didn't ask." He looked at the table. He said, "No, I didn't." I zipped up my bag. I pulled on my coat. I picked up my folder. I had driven up here half wanting him to see me, and half knowing it wouldn't change anything. And now that it had happened, now that a woman he respected had said my name in a room full of people and watched his face change, I didn't feel the rush I'd expected. I didn't feel vindicated the way I thought I would. I just felt tired. Not the tired of someone who has lost something. The tired of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally quietly decided to set it down. I said, "I'm going to send you my invoice by the end of the week." He nodded. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button for the lobby. The doors opened. I stepped in. On the way down, I thought about my mother and the Saturday math problems, and the CBC playing in the background and the job site in the rain and the hard hat, 2 sizes too big for my head. I thought about the load-bearing wall, how you have to look at the whole structure to understand what's holding it up. How sometimes what looks like the most solid part isn't supporting anything at all. How what looks like a gap, a void, an absence, sometimes that's exactly where the real weight has been resting all along. The elevator reached the lobby. I walked out into the Ottawa cold, and I kept walking.